Good morning. Here is your early warning morning briefing for Tuesday, the 4th of February, 2025. I'm joined by the team, Jared and Mike. Robert is out today, but let's jump inside the Beltway. So today, as many of you are aware, the blanket tariffs that the Trump administration was planning on imposing on Mexico and Canada have now been delayed for 1 month for each of those countries, respectively. This came on the heels of an announcement that yesterday was the final day that the blanket tariff of 25% would be imposed on imports from Mexico and Canada, and then came alongside a 10% tariff on Canadian energy imports. But there has been a 30-day delay, so this will be pushed until the 4th of March before these tariffs would be reimposed. Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said that these U.S. tariffs on Canadian goods would be postponed as there would be negotiations on a border deal. And this also coincides with Mexico negotiating a similar delay after agreeing to send thousands of troops to the U.S.-Mexico border. Also, the Trump administration said that it will immediately implement the tariffs if the border situation with Canada and Mexico does not continue to improve. Mike, what's your take on this?
Yeah, well, I was pretty hopeful that Trump and Sheinbaum would be able to make a deal. Trump and the former Mexican president, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, they had a good working relationship. And his AMLO successor, Claudia Sheinbaum, now she's in a position where she needs funding. She wants to build these factories up on the northern border in Mexico, continue to be a major relocation hub for American manufacturing, moving out of China and the broader Indo-Pacific. And so Mexico essentially has this, it's not exactly a Green New Deal, but she's a technocrat. She has a PhD in environmental engineering. She is very pro green energy. And so she needs money to do that. And so I think this is an area where the United States and Mexico can continue to have cooperation. I did notice, however, that Sheinbaum and Trump both kind of took a victory lap after this delay, at least for these tariffs. Sheinbaum said the United States was going to do more to stop guns flowing into Mexico. Trump said Mexico's moving 10,000 National Guard troops to the border. And, Mexico had already moved some of those National Guard troops. I'm not sure exactly how many more they're putting up there. But really the bottom line here is that if we see an improvement in cutting down illegal immigrants on the Mexico side, and then also cutting down the fentanyl trade, fentanyl smuggling into the United States. If we see progress on that, I think things will be cool. If we don't see progress on that, then tariffs are obviously back on the table.
Yeah, and Mike, something else that's going on is, I mentioned at the very top of this also coincides with a 10% tariff, or excuse me, there's also additional tariffs that are going to be have been imposed on China as well. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the retaliatory, countermeasures that China is imposing as well. But, all these things are related. And so when it comes to some of these negotiations between Mexico, Canada, and then China's always looming in the background here. And so, depending on how Canada or Mexico moves forward with some of these tariffs, it will have a major impact on China and then how China responds. And so it's really interesting to see all three of these work together. It's, we might have a tendency to isolate one country over the other, but they're all watching each other because, when it comes to China and Mexico, for example, that fear that a lot of these jobs and a lot of the labor that we're currently using in China, that will shift over to Mexico is very real to China. And so I imagine that as these different world leaders make decisions and come to the negotiating table, it will also pressure countries like China as well to accelerate their negotiations.
Mm-hmm. Can I just add one thing here, Mark? It's really amazing to see. It's like everyone forgot Trump's first term, where he would have this opening statement on negotiation, and we're going to put tariffs on you, or we're going to do this or that. And it's a negotiating tactic. It's just a bargaining tactic. And so this is exactly what's happening here. I just want to point out that I think what Trump is really doing here, not signaling to like Denmark and the European Union, China, Mexico, Canada, he's telling everyone that the old way of doing business is over. And under different conditions, maybe the United States could continue to play the world's ATM and enforcer. Trump was obviously elected to end the status quo, business as usual. And so we've seen a lot of these U.S. allies be upset. And I think the reality has hit them that they have to deal with reality now. The reality is that the United States is no longer going to be the world's ATM. And they really got too comfortable with the status quo. It's clear that the status quo is failing both the United States and the world. Surely they have to recognize this. And so what we're seeing now is, yes, it's jarring, and a lot of people are kind of freaking out about it and talking about the price of eggs, and this is the Trump tax on consumers. And but the fact of the matter is, Trump is making badly needed changes and setting up new terms for how the world is going to work. And it's just better to rip the Band-Aid off right now and get it over with, rather than gently peel it over the course of years, because we really don't have years here. So U.S. allies, I think they need to understand that it's no longer the 1990s. We don't live in that world anymore. An insecure is really an insecure world. It's kind of like when you're on a plane, you've got to put your oxygen mask on first before putting on others. And I think this is pretty much what Trump's trying to do. And hopefully they'll understand that, and hopefully they'll also get over it.
Great perspective. Thanks, Mike. All right, moving on to our next piece. The Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, has ordered the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the CFPB, to stop all rulemaking, communications, and lawsuits yesterday. Now, President Donald Trump is expected to appoint new directors of the Federal Deposit Insurance Company, that's FDIC, and Commodity Futures Trading Commission, CFTC, according to a person familiar with the plans. Now, what's the big picture here? So reforming the CFPB has been a longstanding priority for congressional Republicans and key Trump donors. For those that are not familiar with the CFPB, this is considered a air quotes independent agency through the Federal Reserve. It was created in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. It's also been at the forefront of pressuring different banks and then also big tech companies, imposing some of its regulatory pressure on Wall Street and on Silicon Valley in an effort often to pursue political objectives. At least that's what the Trump administration has alleged. This has been a central part of what we have discussed many times here about the Obama administration's plans to nudge banks to debank different Trump administration officials or political appointees as politically exposed persons. And so all of this pressure, especially from Silicon Valley wanting to be more deregulated, there's also the crypto element where we have crypto exchanges and companies like that want more deregulation for digital fund transfer. All of these things have been impacted by the CFPB. And so this shakeup over with the regulatory apparatus under the Trump administration is really likely an effort to finally put the CFPB under the appropriations process. This would make sure that Congress has oversight over it, to also deregulate digital fund transfers, a huge priority for Silicon Valley, and then also prevent regulators from this nudging of banks to debank Trump administration officials, political appointees, and so on. And so this is one of those, this is a major priority. It has been for a long time, not only on the Hill with Congress, but also with key Trump donors and Trump administration officials. And so with this shakeup over there, it's very likely that the CFPB will be pulled under regular oversight. And from there, we could see major changes in terms of how some of these political moves have been made within the financial and regulatory apparatus. All right, and then finally moving on to our hearings for the day. So over in the Senate, we have a hearing to examine the poisoning of America. This will focus on fentanyl and its analogs, and then there will also be a discussion of permanent class scheduling for that. We will monitor that and update you with any key developments. All right, and finally, moving over to our warning items for the day. Looks like China has retaliated with its limited tariffs of its own. As we mentioned, we had blanket tariffs, the threat of blanket tariffs to be imposed on Mexico and Canada. China also was hit with some limited tariffs of its own, but now we have some retaliatory countermeasures coming from China. Mike, could you please walk us through that a little bit?
Yeah, so for a long time, we have been looking at how China is going to retaliate, not just against Trump now, but even under Biden. There was the Science Act and the CHIPS Act and these federal efforts to block certain technologies from China, especially in the semiconductor market. And so we've really talked a lot about China has a lot of leeway because they make, or they are the originator of so much of the stuff that we need. And so we've talked about China potentially putting export controls on some of their technology, blocking exports on solar panels. I mean, I think, Jared, they make like the majority of the world's solar panels, or 60 or 90% or something like that. You remember how much that is?
I want to say it's north of 80. They
Yeah.
they have a massive controlling share of solar panels.
Mhm. Yeah, and something that we also talked about back in 2022, Ross Kennedy, he was a big logistics guy. He pointed out if China really wanted to take the United States to the mat, they just block exports of these chemical precursors to U.S. pharmaceuticals. So it really doesn't matter if these U.S. Pharmaceuticals for Americans are reshored to be manufactured in the United States. The precursor chemicals still come from China. So there are a lot of ways that China could make this ugly. I don't think they want to make it ugly. In fact, they don't want to make it ugly, and I think they're doing this to save face and to not appear to cave like China, or like Canada and Mexico have. Some have made it out in the U.S. media to do that. So at any rate, China imposed some export controls on U.S. coal and liquid natural gas, as well as 5 strategic metals. These are very important because these are used in defense manufacturing. I'm still kind of at a loss why China continues to take their rare earth minerals out of the ground and send them to the United States so that we can put them in missiles that may be aimed at China one day. But they're put export controls on tungsten, which is commonly used for electronics, aviation, and defense production. China produces about 80% of the world's global tungsten, of the tungsten production. So that's a really big deal. Also, China announced antitrust investigations into several U.S. companies, including Google, and added them to a blacklist. And so the United States and China have been adding each other's countries to blacklists. So that's what's going on.
Yeah, and Mike, this comes on the heels of news also that China. We've talked about this before, but China's. I think there's been a lot of speculation about China bringing back a really big stick against the United States, and I think a lot of these fears are overblown. China does have leverage. I think this is why you're seeing a much targeted approach from the Trump administration with China versus maybe Mexico or Canada when we talk about blanket tariffs, because really the leverage differential is very different with China and the United States. So these countermeasures from China are probably going to accelerate negotiations between the U.S. and China. I don't think a full-on trade war is in anybody's interest. I don't think either party really wants that. Trump also will be receiving some increased pressure from business leaders and key allies in Congress about this. And then also China's on its heels a little bit as well, because it will risk scaring away foreign investment, which it very much needs right now. We've talked about this before. There's been a capital shift moving away from China. There have been businesses and multinationals that have been leaving China. China desperately needs capital. This is something, because it's such an export heavy country, it really needs a lot of this investment. And the trade war would have a devastating impact on its access to that much needed capital. And so really what we're seeing here is that both parties are going to most likely have to go to the negotiation table early and work these things out. But there will probably be a few other additional countermeasures as well that will just accelerate the process. But I do think it's worth noting there's a lot of kind of chicken little stuff going on in the media right now. A lot of journalists are making this sound like this is going to turn into a massive trade war. I don't think that is likely if we want to consult the past. Mike, you brought up Trump's first term. We can look at other cases like this. China is more aggressive this time around, but both the United States and China, it's really in their best interest to find a way to go to the negotiating table. And it seems that, as you mentioned before, Mike, this is really the Trump administration trying to flex as much of its leverage as possible. China's also flexing its leverage. And so what we'll likely see come out of this is a negotiation and a deal. All right. Moving on to our next item. So during this, as we have these looming threats of tariffs, and then also we've had these targeted tariffs more recently, looks like oil refiners, global oil traders have said that U.S. refiners are likely to look to Latin America or the Middle East as alternative sources for crude oil after President Donald Trump has threatened to levy a 10% tariff on oil exports from Canada. Mike, do you have any perspective on this?
Well, not a lot. I was just really wondering why we're trying to buy. I guess it's a cost issue, but why we're trying to buy crude oil from Latin America and the Middle East when we can pump it out of the ground here. And I think that's kind of what we arrived at, right, Mark? It's a cost issue.
Yeah, that's always the big question is like the United States has a lot of oil. We have a lot of infrastructure for this as well. So the question's always, why aren't we just, when we say we're energy independent, why aren't we really just focusing on that and becoming more self-sufficient and just utilizing our own oil stores here? I think, it can be very complex. And the more I've dug into it, it appears that we're kind of dealing with two things here. Is we do have a lot of oil reserves. We have a lot of that infrastructure, but at the same time, we still have a global trade apparatus that can make the prices of this a lot cheaper to still go out on the open market or to rely on foreign sources that are closer by. I think the big takeaway here, though, is that it's very likely as we kind of see this reshoring, as we see the supply chains tighten up, get closer to home, it's very likely that as the United States has to resort to looking for sources of oil to get those prices under control, to make sure that the domestic market is well taken care of, that it's going to be looking a lot closer to home rather than farther away or in areas that are going to be torn by conflict. And so this kind of opens us up to, the Western Hemisphere, for example. And so Latin America, as we mentioned before, is probably going to be something that the Trump administration and future administrations look closer at. I think this is an inevitable process. I don't think that at the same time we talk a lot about how the world's changing. I don't think that many in Washington have really caught up with that. But really what we're seeing here, it's not just a strategic effort by the Trump administration to bring these supply chains closer to home. It's also a natural consequence of the way that the world is changing. And so, while the Trump administration is now, we're talking about tariffs on Canadian oil, we'll likely see a deal come out of that. I think that what we'll see is that these alternative crude sources will be closer to home. We'll probably see a lot more cooperation from some of these other countries within the Western Hemisphere, and oil will be a major part of that. And so, yes, I think the big picture here, we're likely to see a lot of continual disruptions, a lot of uncertainty, but there will be alternative crude sources closer to home, and the United States is most likely ready to prosecute that. All right, moving on finally. So, Jared, let's pull you up here. All right, so it looks like we're all talking about tariffs. So that's been the big topic of the day. What's going on over in Taiwan right now in relation to this?
Absolutely. Good morning. Well, it's not staying in Taiwan. Taiwan's government pledged additional support to hundreds of companies they have operating in Mexico and Canada. They also pledged to assist any companies planning to relocate to the United States with location and regulation information. And Taiwan's Ministry of Economic Affairs added that it's actively looking for American state and local support to move Taiwanese companies into America. Now, why are they doing this? What's the big point? The why is, first off, Taiwan is facing a 100% tariff from the Trump administration's coming right from Taiwanese sources. As it stands, Mexico and Canada have no tariffs, obviously with the threat of a 25%, but even 25% is significantly lower than what Taiwan would face. So I think what we're seeing here is really the act of using tariffs is accelerating nearshoring and reshoring efforts. And if you pay attention to where these are, Taiwan is in a potential conflict zone. Canada and Mexico really aren't. And we've talked a lot about the regionalization of supply chains, making sure that supply chains, if they must stay international, can at least be far more secure than like being in the Pacific. In Mexico and Canada, both of those supply chains, aside from being overland, can be much more easily protected by something like the U.S. military, as it's all within our own region. It's very hard to threaten those supply chains.
And Jared, I mean, do you have any perspective on the scope here? Like, how much does Taiwan? I mean, I know that we've talked a lot about some of the semiconductor work. There's been a lot of collaboration with Taiwan, and then also some of our own semiconductor efforts here in the United States. But I mean, does Taiwan have a pretty sizable presence in Mexico, in Canada? And I mean, obviously, we've talked about the United States.
In the initial release, Taiwan was saying they had over 300 companies operating in Mexico. So I'd say pretty large.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you, Jared. All right. Moving on now, Jared. So it looks like another big key issue here is there's been a lot of consternation about withdrawing from the climate accords. This is a longstanding Trump priority. We saw this back in 2016. So what's going on with that? Do you have some updates?
Yes, so Indonesian and Argentinian officials voiced opposition to continuing in the Paris Climate Agreement after President Trump announced America's withdrawal. Now, the Indonesian climate envoy, the guy in charge of their entire green transition, declared it entirely unfair that he should have to cut coal power while America does not have to do anything to reduce its emissions. Now, I think what we're seeing here is an enormous soft power opportunity for all great powers. If you are an energy exporter, here's your opportunity to go, okay, fine, we won't do green energy with you. We'll help you do conventional energy. Now, the ones that can rapidly build conventional power plants, I think, have the greatest opportunity here, especially if they can achieve the attendant fuel supply chains. But in President Trump's first term, America was a net energy exporter. If I remember right, it was particularly for LNG, liquid natural gas. So that may be another avenue we attempt to do. Once we achieve energy exporting status again, maybe we achieve that, or maybe we attempt to start influencing people into these conventional means of power production in order to give them more reliable power, bring them more on site, and move them away from Chinese and Russian energy exports.
Okay, and Jared, so we're seeing Indonesia. Have you seen, and I guess Argentina as well, have you seen any other nations, or is this so far kind of a small group of nations that are following the U.S.?
It seems small so far. I need to double check who exactly is really facing like power instability and who has unrealistic timelines. That was one of the things that prompted Indonesia to go this route. Is they're looking all of their timelines, even out to 2040. They're sitting here going, there's no way we can really meet this without enormous expenditure. So I think we're going to see a lot of probably quiet withdrawals from the climate accords, maybe even just not non-compliance without ever actually officially withdrawing.
Yeah, and Jared, to add some perspective here too, with when we look at the corporate America, when we look at some of the research that's being done and the expectations as we look at futures and we see what the future outlook looks like from Wall Street, right? There's been a lot of literature that I've been digging through that some of these big Wall Street firms expect that this issue, of the clean or green energy revolution, of clean energy technology kind of surpassing some of these older energy resources, that this is what, there seems to be a little bit of a retreat here. There's a lot of expectations that I've been reading in the literature where a lot of these guys are expecting some of these old the fossil fuels to be a lot more important in the near future. And they've kind of started to hedge against some of these green energy technologies and these accords. And I think this all has that political translation as well, because it seems that the world is kind of readjusting to a new normal, where a lot of these green goals and objectives seem to be a little bit too lofty, or they're quietly walking away from those. So we're seeing, at the same time we're seeing this happen politically, we're also seeing this happen with a lot of companies. We talked a lot about the changing landscape of ESG. This is something that's happening simultaneously with a lot of these political developments as well. And so I think that this will be something that we'll have to continue to watch. But it seems that if there is a trend here, the trend is to move a little bit away from some of these lofty climate goals and to focus a little bit more on making sure that these countries have reliable sources of energy, which often are fossil fuels. Okay, so that does it for today's report. We do have some questions here in the chat that I think we'd like to get to. Red Flyer Media says that the overregulation in the U.S. will be cut back. Excuse me, sorry. No, I got from Wayne. Excuse me. So the question is refinery fires. The question was, refineries are a choke point, correct? Any movement on helping refineries? Yes, Wayne, and I don't know if any of the other guys have any perspective on this, but refinery fires are always a present risk or a continual risk, and that they can be a choke point. There's actually a lot of things like this that impact the industry overall. And we're talking about domestic energy production. This is something where the United States, we have some of the best infrastructure and protocols here for being energy independent. But again, the thing that we have to compete with energy independence is that we're always dealing with a global market, and those global markets often present other opportunities for us to get energy for cheaper. Maybe there's supplies of energies that we can be able to have access to, and so there's a lot of levers that we'll have to pull. And so there are certain choke points, there are certain risks and difficulties that the United States and other countries around the world face. But at the same time, we're dealing with a global economy, which will present opportunities for the United States to be able to access energy in other ways, cheaper ways. And so often when we talk about energy independence, we have the capacity for being energy independent, but that doesn't always mean that we'll be getting the bulk of our energy from the United States or even Canada. And so hopefully I answered your question there. It's a little bit difficult, but okay. Well, we had some good questions earlier in the week.
Hey, Mark, can I jump on real quick?
Yeah, absolutely, Mike.
Yeah, listen, the United States still gets a lot of refined petroleum products from overseas, especially the East Coast gets like 20 or 30% or something like that imported. So, and the rest of that stuff that they get from pipelines. So refineries, they still are the bottleneck here in the United States. And a lot of these refineries, they are built to refine certain types of oil, like sweet light crude or heavy sour. Mexico produces a lot of oil. Why don't we import a lot of crude oil from Mexico? Because our refineries aren't built to refine that heavy sour crude. So it's not as simple as we can go get oil from any country in the world and we can refine it here. There's a lot of the chemical compositions of the oil really matter, first of all. The second thing is we have not built a major refinery since 1997. We did put one over in Channelview, which is outside of Houston, in 2022. So it doesn't matter how much oil we have in the ground or how much oil is all around the world. Yes, this is correct. If we do not have the capacity to refine it, then we're not getting gasoline and diesel or any other refined petroleum products. So I really do think, Wayne, that is the bottom line there. If we want more consumption of domestic oil, we need more domestic refineries.
Thank you, Mike. All right. Well, that does it for today's report. We appreciate the questions. We'll get to any questions that are not answered during the show. Again, we'll address those during the roundtable this Friday at 10 Central Time. But thank you for joining us. Expect today's report in your inbox later today. We will also be back usual time at 08 Central Time tomorrow morning. Thank you for all your support. Thank you for tuning in. And as always, stay out front.